Welcome everybody. This is Michael Roberts in another interview with somebody who's going to tell us all about, on this occasion, the situation in Mexico, the Mexican economy, and the impact of COVID on the Mexican economy and of Mexican capitalism. We're very lucky to have Abelardo Marina Flores, who's a professor at the Metropolitan Autonomous University in Mexico City, or UAM, and he and his colleague Sergio Camara Izquierdo have produced a whole range of papers on the nature of the Mexican economy, the changes that have taken place over the last 30, 40, 50 years, and of course, in general, upon political economy from a Marxist viewpoint as well. So it's a great opportunity for us to consider what's happening in Mexico at the moment, the state of Mexican capitalism from Abelardo's viewpoint. And just looking at the figures today on the COVID-19 cases and deaths, Mexico is in real trouble. We're hitting nearly 20,000 deaths in Mexico now. Just a huge figure of 165,000 cases of infection already. The deaths per million are now at 156 per million, which is fast catching up with countries even like Brazil or Peru, who already have gone over the 200 mark and are heading towards European levels of deaths per million. So the pandemic is still spreading and intensifying in South and Latin America. And here we have an economy, Mexican economy, which is in depression, it's in recession. It's been in recession last year, really. And the COVID is now expecting the OECD, of which Mexico is a member, supposedly a more advanced economy, is likely to have a fall in GDP of something like 8% this year, according to the OECD. So this is a serious situation. But Abelardo is the man for us to talk to about this situation. So I'm going to hand over to him and he can tell us more about it.
Thank you very much, Bob. If you can let me share my...
Yeah, that's right. Let me just let you share. Okay.
Okay. Just a second. Do you see the presentation?
Yeah, we do. We see that. You're on going through various slides now.
Is it, do you see only one of the graphs or
I see a slide on the top and then a whole gallery of slides beneath that in a small group. That's it. Now I see one slide, number one.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think that's it. Yeah. That's
yeah,
okay.
There we are. Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, the general context is that the world economy has shown slowdown trends since the end of 2018, and especially because of the contraction of the volume of international trade of merchandises, that it's linked with commercial wars that Mr. Donald Trump has initiated. Also, the real GDP, the world real GDP has been slowing down. In 2019 is 1 point under the 2017 level, from 3.9 to 2.9. Well, this is the general context. In Mexico, we have had recessive trends since the second quarter of last year, 2019. Now we have had 4 negative quarters. Here we have this graph. The annual GDP growth was barely below 0 negative in 2019. But as you see, this has been a long-term slowdown trend since 2015. What are the causes of this? Well, here we show that the main sectors that explain the slowdown of the Mexican economy are, on the one side, the construction sector, which has had a very steep slowdown since August of 2018. This date is important, August 2018. And this slowdown of the construction sector was complemented at the end of last year of a relatively more mild contraction of the manufacturing sector at the end of the year. What are the causes behind these recessive trends in the Mexican economy? First of all, and the most important element, is that since the election of 2018 in July, election in which Andrés Manuel López Obrador won the election with a progressive program with, with a progressive program, there has been a practical productive investment lockout carried out by the private sector in Mexico. As we say, Mexicans, we voted more than 30 million for the new government on July 2018. But immediately next month, the big enterprises in Mexico have been voting, restraining from investing. So that's a very big element that explains the slowdown of the Mexican economy. The slowdown of the value of exports at the end of last year, it's explained, well, in general, oil, as we know, there has been a decrease of prices, and manufacture was affected at the end of the year, especially auto and auto parts, because of the uncertainties around the ratification of the new trade agreement for Mexico, United States, and Canada. So here we see a graph in which we show gross fixed capital investment, monthly figures. And as you see, the black line, the slowdown begins 1 month after the Progressive Party won the election. And it has had a very continuous downtrend. This has affected, evidently, the construction sector. Non-residential construction has had a very deep decrease also. And evidently, it also has affected the machinery and equipment subsectors in the manufacturing sector. So the conclusion is the recessive trends in Mexico have a very important political and ideological element, explaining element. Okay, what had been the effects of this recession? Paradoxically, although the value of exports has diminished, the value of imports has diminished even more. And this diminishing of the value of imports, it's also associated to the recessive trends. Especially, we have here this blue line. This blue line shows the capital goods imports, especially machinery and equipment. So we have a paradoxical result in which these recessive trends in Mexico have had a relatively positive effect on the current account. This is important to mention because the Mexican peso is not receiving devaluation pressures. So there's not a pressure on international reserves. There's not a pressure on the exchange rate. Well, what are the initial economic effects in Mexico from COVID? First of all, it's evident. We knew it was going to happen. It's happening all over the world. There's a deepening of the recession because of the lockdown and the collapse of GDP. The most negatively affected sectors are, firstly, construction, evidently, manufacturing sector, specifically the transport equipment subsector, entertainment, sports and culture, and also hotels and restaurants. Here we have a graph that shows this deep contraction since February of this year. As you see, construction has diminished almost 40%, and manufacturing also has diminished around 40%. Up to this data is up to April of this year. The big effect, well, the negative effect started in March. The restriction of movement and of economic activities started to operate middle March, the second part of March, and April has been completely locked down. So we have this very scary data that shows the level of contraction of the Mexican economy. Here we put the data of specific manufacturing subsectors. As you see, the most affected are transport equipment, which is the purple line. It's 80% reduction of production in the transport equipment subsector. Leather, apparel, and all the textile industry have been very, very much affected. Leather, it's incredible. It's almost 90% is completely shut down.
Wow.
So the effects are being very, very, very harsh on the levels of activity. What's the other set of effects of COVID on labor? We have, in the first place, the layoffs. The layoffs have been concentrated, especially in the construction sector and in the services sector. In the services sector, there's a lot of informal employment. So very small businesses, restaurants, especially, shops, but the workers are informal, so there's no way if the shop closes, the people don't get to work. So the layoffs have been specifically in this sector, and also in small manufacturing firms. Okay? So that's important. There's also been a very interesting and amazing effect that it's a big plunge of economic active population. In In terms of numbers, the layoffs, in Mexico, we don't have a very good register of employment because more than half of the employed people are informal. So we have indirect measures, surveys that indicate us what's happening with the levels of employment. The layoffs are measured traditionally through the people that belong to the Mexican Institute of Social Security. These are formal workers of the private sector. And up to May, there has been a decrease of 1 million workers registered in this institute. 1 million is around, there's around 20 million registered, so 1 million, it's important in absolute terms, but it's not so big in terms of proportionate. But in terms of the people that have abandoned the active economic population, the latest survey, that it's a special survey because it was done through telephone for the first time, it shows that 12 million people have abandoned the economic active population. 12 million is a big hunk. It's mostly informal workers or workers that work in very precarious, that have very precarious works, that they have to be distancing from everybody, so they stay home, and they don't seek for a job because they know they're not gonna get anything. So these are mainly, as I said, informal workers. Another effect on labor has been a very big reduction on the hours worked per worker, evidently in the formal sector. This is the manufacturing sector. As you see, for the whole manufacturing sector, the reduction of monthly working hours has been of around 30%. And in the equipment, transport equipment, it has been of 70%. So that subsector, very much linked with the exports to the US, is almost completely shut down. One thing that it's interesting, since the new government took office in 2018, we had seen a continuous increase in the real wages all over the economy. That was one of the main strategies in the campaign, the necessity to start recovering the purchasing power of wages, salaries, that has been very much affected during 40 years of neoliberalism. And Mexico specifically, it was almost the only Latin American country that hadn't experienced a recovery in the minimal wages in the past 10 years. So this upward trend in the real wages sadly has been stopped by the COVID pandemic. Evidently, here we have a problem of some of the workers haven't been fired, but they have to go home and they don't receive their whole payment. So this is a general vision of the economic effects of the COVID on the Mexican economy. It's a very short run analysis, but well, that's the objective. Now to open the discussion, what's the situation in Mexico is of a persistent political confrontation. Yes, since the Progressive Party, Morena, won the election in 2018, segments of the bourgeoisie, the opposition parties, and former government, I don't know what I put there, former government staff, rightist groups, some of them far-right groups, have been trying to organize an opposition against the new government. They have been periodically, they have a very aggressive discourse. They are planning different scenarios of coup d'etat, following the experiences, especially in Brazil. And in terms of the COVID crisis, the discussion has been very much focused on how to face the COVID crisis. And the discussion has been very much around debt. This segment of the bourgeoisie has been claiming that it's necessary for the government to ask for external resources from the IMF, from everywhere, just like Salvador did or Chile did. But their idea is evidently to rescue the big firms. The government has been very, very clear about this. There's not going to be new debt to rescue capitalist firms. The argument is that this formula has been the same since the 1980s. It has been a failed formula. In Mexico, we're still paying the rescues derived from the 1995 tequila crisis. And on the other side, the richest people in Mexico, which are mostly the owners of these big capitalist firms, have deposits in the US of around $75 billion. So the government has been very, very clear that there's not going to be an increase in at least external debt. What are the economic policies on which the government has focused? There's a lot of debate. In terms of the contingency programs, the government, what has done is to make a big redistribution of the approved budget towards employment programs in urban, rural, towards the health sector, direct helps, and low interest credits for around $26 billion, especially for informal workers that have lost their job and micro firms that have had to close. $26 billion, it's around 2% of GDP. On the other side, the Bank of Mexico, which is autonomous, launched a 30 billion program to support the financial system. Supposedly half of these 30 billion should be canalized by the banks, the private banks, to the micro, small, and medium-sized firms. So this is a very important aspect of the contingency programs, one by the government, the other by the financial sector. Economic policies. Another element, another important element is that the government has ratified the strategic projects that that it had in its original program, in the campaign, and in the national development plan, which are the construction of the Maya train in the Yucatan Peninsula, a transisthmic train between the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean in the isthmus of Tehuantepec, an oil refinery, and at the new Mexico City International Airport. These strategic projects are going to be carried by mixed investment, government investment and private investment. And the idea is, since the beginning of the government, that these projects will help to redynamize the investment, the productive investment in the country, especially infrastructure, and try to, through these programs, reactivate employment and economic activity. The rightist opposition to the Mexican government, at the same time it was asking that it is asking for more external debt, has been asking for the suspension of these strategic projects. So the government has also been very firm. Evidently there are some postponements on the start of these projects, but the studies that are going to support these projects continue to advance. Moreover, there's a discussion that is present that was present in the campaign, but with the crisis, it's generalizing the idea in the government and in the progressive and in the majority of the population that we need a general reorientation of policy objectives. It is clear now the government had already started a program in such direction that we have to reconstruct a universal healthcare and education systems, free for all people. In particular, measures have been taken to universalize the superior education access to the population in Mexico. Now in the Constitution, it's compulsory for the state to give all levels of education to all people. Evidently, to reorientate the policy to the most vulnerable social segments. What are the perspectives? The perspectives, I think, are general in all the world. It's uncertainty. The word is uncertainty. The pandemic, the COVID pandemic in Mexico. This is paradoxical. As we were talking before, we are having right now around 750 deaths daily. As Bob said, we are reaching the rates per million people, deaths per million people. We are advancing toward the European levels. But interestingly, the government has been successful in flattening the curve. If you compare the curves in Spain, in United States, in Mexico, really, in Mexico, the curve is very, very flat. That has been very good because there hasn't been a saturation of the health system, the hospitals. The hospitals are still operating at levels of 80, 85%. That was a very big risk because we have a completely devastated health system. So that has been a success. But paradoxically, this has meant that the extension of the pandemic is being excessive. We have had already 3 weeks in a plateau. A plateau with 600, 700 deaths every day. Sometimes it goes a little up, a little down. But it's a very, very long plateau, and I think it will extend more. So this means that the extension will have more effects on the duration of the recession. This last week, there was an analysis in the different states of Mexico, and the idea was that maybe this weekend we could pass from red to orange, for example, in Mexico City, starting to reactivate some non-essential activities. But the decision was to continue with the red light at least another week, not only in Mexico City, but in other states. perspectives relating the recession. This is going to be very much dependent on the resilience of formal, small, and medium-sized firms. Here, the important issue is that these formal, small, and medium-sized firms really have general access to credit to restart activities. They haven't closed, they haven't lay off their employees, but they are in the in the last moment of, they are ending their liquidity reserves. So it's very important that these two programs, the government and the Bank of Mexico through the commercial banking system, really accelerates the access to this segment of the economy, so they can restart activities and they don't have to close down. Yeah, that's going to be very important because this sector is very, very important in terms of employment. Another important element is going to be the resilience of informal, micro, and small firms. This is much more casuistic because in reality, these informal, micro, and small firms are always opening, closing. So I guess when the economic activity starts to open, many of these informal firms are going to start operating again. The informal workers are going to return slowly to the economically active population, evidently. But everything is very uncertain. What we've been trying to do in Mexico, well, progressive sectors, academic, political, is that we have to work towards a new normality. This double crisis, recession and pandemic, have shown to everybody the negative long-term effects of 40 years of neoliberalism all over the world. It's very clear that we have to reconstruct the social services almost from scrap. That's one thing that it's true. In Mexico, we have a deficit of 2,100 doctors, 200,000 doctors. In this emergency, the government has hired 30,000 doctors, but we still have a very big deficit. We have to reduce the dependency on maquila exports. Mexican economy is completely dependent on the maquila exports, auto industry. That's why the recession has hit our economy so badly, because 80% of our exports are maquila manufacturing, and most of it is to the United States. So the close down of the United States auto industry has had a very big impact, negative impact on the Mexican economy. So we have to expand the domestic market so it recovers at least partially and slowly its role as the motor of engine, one of the engines of economic activity accumulation. But here we have to be very careful, because the expansion of the domestic market, yes, it has to be based on the increase of demand by generating employment and increasing the purchasing power of workers. But it also has to depend on the expansion of supply, especially of the production of basic products, agriculture, agro-industry, food, clothing, housing. Because if we don't do this, we'll have the typical external imbalances that have accompanied all the progressive, demand-led progressive programs. because there's a destroyed economic internal structure. So there's not the capacity to really supply quantitatively and increasing demand from the workers. So it's very important to revitalize the domestic market, but not only from a demand side, but also from a supply side. In this case, it's also important, there's a big discussion, is one of the strategies of the government to promote social solidarity and sustainable economic projects. With a very communal component in Mexico, communal relations are still very, very strong, despite the 40 years of neoliberalism. People have family and communal networks. That's why people easily get out of the economically active population, because they have a family, extended family. They're not going to die from hunger because there's these communal networks. And these projects should be, they have to have a local base and evidently an ecological perspective. This, as I said, is a priority in this new government's program. But nowadays, when we are preparing for the new normality, we are putting a lot of effort in trying to advance in concrete projects of this kind. Well, that's what I have to say about the effects of this pandemic on the Mexican economy and some of the perspectives for the future.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Can you get out of that? I've still got your screen. I need to get rid of it, don't I?
Yeah, I already.
Right.
Is it gone?
It's not quite gone. Let me see if I can find the stop share thing.
Because I stopped sharing.
Yeah, you stopped sharing.
Yeah, sure.
So thank you, Abelardo. That was a pretty comprehensive account of what's been going on in Mexico in the immediate period, and in particular, what's happened since the new president came into office, AMLO as he's called for short, and the opposition, the division that exists between his political forces, which brought him into office after all these years, against the traditional bourgeois parties, the PRI, PAN, and now, as you mentioned, other right-wing groups who seek to disrupt the government during this COVID and are looking for ways in which they can balance up the forces of international capital and their own bourgeois interests against the interests of the general people. So this is a major battle, which obviously is going to take place in the environment of COVID. But perhaps I could just ask you, I noticed in your charts that you mentioned that the maquila exports have been completely destroyed during COVID. For those viewers who don't know what that is basically exports in special economic zones were set up, maybe, I don't know, you'll tell me better, Abelardo, but say 30 years ago, in order to directly export back into the US. And these exports were often done by foreign companies, US companies, autos and other things to export back into the US in special zones in the northern part of Mexico on the whole, as I understand it. And it struck me, looking at the data, one of the things that struck me about that zone was that it was connected to the introduction of the North American Free Trade Association, NAFTA, of which Mexico and the US and Chile are part. And one of the features of it is that NAFTA doesn't seem to have benefited Mexican economy whatsoever. And the maquila sector is really like a separate sector from the rest of Mexico. The rest of Mexico is cut off And this operation is just using Mexican labor and facilities in order to allow US capital to expand and develop, rather than provide any sort of generation or redistribution to the rest of the Mexican economy. Is that the case, or have I got that wrong?
No, completely. The maquila sector has been very important in Mexico. It was established in the mid-60s.
Much older, yeah.
Yeah, the maquila sector, it's interesting because it was designed specifically as a tax exemption for foreign enterprises to import, to re-export to the United States. So the idea since the origin is to take advantage of low-wage workers in Mexico. So it operated since 1965. It's interesting because in the 70s, the maquila expands importantly in Mexico, especially at the end of the 70s. And it's it's one of the expressions of the geographical relocation strategies of many transnational firms. So it's not very, in absolute terms, it's very important, not in relative terms. But since the end of the 70s, it has an increase. Then the big crisis, the 82 crisis comes, Latin America, the debt crisis. And in 1985, the maquila regime is extended. Firstly, it only covered the northern frontier to the United States. But in 85, it's extended to all the country. So it has a very, very big increase. So in reality, when NAFTA starts operating in 95, the maquila has already become the most dynamic segment of the Mexican economy. So that's interesting because
it's already hollowed out. The Mexican economy's domestic market, domestic production has already been hollowed out by the maquila and the development of American capital. It's just being used as a source for American capital.
Yeah, the main export of Mexico is cheap labor, directly through immigration. Immigration source since the 1982 crisis. More than 10 million, 12 million Mexicans have emigrated to the US since 1982. And maquila. So it's directly through immigration and indirectly through maquila production. So yes, and the domestic market has lost its role as the matter of accumulation. But as you clearly say, there has not been a program of increasing integration of the maquila as it happened, for example, in Taiwan. Here, still 80% of inputs are imported from abroad. Yeah.
So the other thing I was looking at, as is my want, I wanted to see how the profitability of Mexican capital was doing. And I was comparing it to the profitability of the US capital. And you can do that through various sources. The pen tables are very good now. And looking at the two, you could see that there was a general downward tendency in the profitability of both Mexican and US capital during the 1970s, which was a worldwide phenomenon, as we know.
Excuse me.
And then in the 1980s, we have the neoliberal reforms, which is an attempt to raise the profitability of capital, and US profitability rose to some extent. But as far as I could see, Mexican profitability of capital continued to decline, along with productivity and investment, so that when we get here to 2020 and after COVID-19, Mexican capital is in a really weak position. It's not really even had a limited recovery under the neoliberal period.
Yes. Just a second, I'm receiving a phone call.
Right. I will stop. Now.
Yeah. what's the problem with profitability and productivity in Mexico? We have an economic structure that depends, as I said before, very much on the maquila sector. The maquila sector is, by definition, almost in Mexico, labor intensive. So fixed capital investment in Mexico is very feeble. When you see the figures, fixed capital investment, well, the fixed capital public investment disappeared practically since the 80s. And it accounted for 40–50% of gross fixed capital non-residential formation.
That's a disaster, losing the public investment sector, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's one of the main issues of the neoliberal structure in Mexico. It's the disappearing of public investment. The private investment is focused more on construction. It's more an extensive scheme of investment, more than machinery and equipment, because
in property and real estate, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and you know, when the maquila, they come and they put cement on the ground, and then they construct these very big plants. And inside you only have tables. There's not much machinery and equipment. So that's a very specific type of secondary export model in Mexico. So productivity is not a main competitive element for the most dynamic segments of the economy. So that I would say that's the main reason that productivity doesn't grow very fast, because the dynamic segments depend on low wages, on permissive ecological regulations. So it's really a sort of, pirate. The transnationals come here as pirates. They just take away the natural resources and the low wage. So the relative surplus mechanism of increasing or the rate of profit doesn't operate very much here in Mexico. So, and the limits of the absolute mechanisms of increasing profitability have been reached. You cannot lower more the wages, you know. it's practically.
The limits. I'm going to ask you a sort of a more difficult question. When AMLO came into office, he was campaigning against huge corruption, the levels of crime from the previous administrations. There was even state murders and so on. The whole environment in Mexico was awful, with supposedly the drug gangs in the north and so on. There was massive inequality. I was looking at figures. If you look at the inequality indexes, Mexico's right at the extreme end of inequality. There's huge regional disparities between the richer parts of Mexico and the poorer ones. The disparity range is much greater than many other countries, levels of poverty and so on, as we've talked about productivity. So AMLO comes into this situation, hopefully to change that, at least to some extent, in the direction of labor. But as you have pointed out, with the result of the COVID, which obviously cuts across it, but also the opposition of the old bourgeois parties and the parts of the state machine and so on. This is a confrontation which is not yet resolved. AMLO has a few more years as a president. What is your view? I know it's uncertainty was your word in your presentation, but perhaps you could take a guess, if you like, how you see things panning out, both on dealing with some of these issues and also whether the bourgeois will be able to restrict, possibly remove the AMLO government as they did with the Workers' Party in Brazil?
Yeah, and the political situation is completely open. The COVID pandemic is a stone in the shoe, evidently, because it will make things much more difficult for the government. You know, it's really amazing. We knew that corruption was general. We knew that it was enormous.
Yeah.
But when the new government takes office, it's unbelievable, the levels of corruption. It's completely unbelievable. There was a parallel government structure whose objective was to steal money. Inside all the government dependencies, and with the business groups outside the government. There are the stealing of gasoline from ducts was maybe 20-30% of gasoline was stolen.
Wow. Wow.
There are some states in which 80% of the gasoline that was sold on the gas stations was robbed. 80%. In the health system, there's estimations that 70% of the budget approved for medicines, equipment, materials was stolen in an organized form.
Has any of this stopped? Has it been stopped, or is it carrying on?
No, the new government said we're going to finish this from the root. So last year was very, very difficult because you're starting a government in which you have to modify all the structures, all the organizative, administrative structures, and you have the trade unions, corporatized. They don't work, and they don't get fired if they don't work. And you have the boycott of the middle range officials of government that are from previous governments. So that situation has been very, very difficult. But the things have been cleaning up, and people are happy about that. Next year we have midterm Congress elections. So next year it's going to be very important because Morena and AMLO, we have a majority in both chambers, legislative chambers. So next year's election, it's going to be very important because the opposition will try to gain majority in the Congress, and that's going to be a first limit to the executive. What are my expectations? I think that AMLO still is going to have a very big support next year, but it's uncertain because especially some segments of the middle classes that voted for AMLO now are turning away it's very natural, it happens all over.
Any particular reason why this section is not so keen anymore?
Because I think it's ideological. I'm very harsh about middle classes. Middle classes the middle classes think that they are the center of the universe. So when a rightist government says we're going, this is a government for private firms, they think they are going to be the recipients of the policies. They don't realize that it's big firms that are going to be favored.
So these petty bourgeois small companies, which is this sector, to some extent supported AMLO because of corruption and the other things before. But now they're worried that their possibilities for keeping their businesses going may be better served by going back to supporting the bourgeois parties, because the bourgeois parties are telling them presumably they're going to reduce tax, make it easier for them.
Yeah, that's the ideological struggle. So it's very important that, as I mentioned in my presentation, that the credits reach this segment of small, medium firms, so they can really restart operations. That's going to be a very, very important element to try to sustain the support of this petite bourgeois for the government. And the president has a very strategic thinking. So I think he knows very clearly that that's going to be a very important issue. So and we are putting pressure from the academics, because there's a lot of bureaucracy, you know.
Yeah.
You cannot come and in 1 year and a half eliminate all the bureaucracy.
Of course
so
not.
we have to push, and we have been very assertive in terms that resources have to reach this segment, this middle class segment, because it's going to be very important to sustain the general support for the government.
Well, I was going to ask you the sort of final question that we started off by saying that the COVID pandemic in Mexico is still rife, as you pointed out, at a very high plateau at best. And the government has obviously not had all the resources health-wise because they've been decimated over the years. But do you think, I mean, is this going to be a decisive issue on popularity in the midterm Congress? How the COVID works out and whether the government copes with it? And how well are they able to cope with it in the next period while we still have it?
Yeah, that's a big question. Up to now, it's manageable. In Mexico, it's very difficult, as in the rest of Latin America. When half of the employed population is informal, you cannot send people to their houses because they earn their food every day. So that's one big problem. So people take care, but they have... you can see it in Mexico City, the different neighborhoods. The middle-class neighborhoods are closed down.
Right.
But the popular neighborhoods are very much having a normal life with some precautions.
They have to do that, don't they? Because they have to work, they have to do things. And they don't have teleworking like we're doing now, or working at home. All the middle-class professionals in the UK are all sitting at home, working from home, still getting their pay, or if they're furloughed off, they're able to sit at home and do the teleworking. But informal people doing jobs of that nature, have to go out. They can't just sit at home.
Yeah, exactly. So let's hope. I think the government, with very scarce resources, has organized a good sanitary response to COVID. There's been a lot of debates. They didn't put resources on tests at the beginning because, there's an international debate. What's the use of tests once you pass to the general dissemination? Now they are starting to put money on the tests, specifically to try to isolate the cases. There's a reactivation of activity.
Test and trace, to try.
So I think in general, the response has been very efficient. There's problems, as there are problems all over. The infection and mortality rates in the health workers is terrible. It's very high, but it's all over the world. It's very, very sad. But I mean, it's very uncertain because we are on 700 daily. We're hoping we don't get to the levels of Brazil, 1,200, 1,300, 1,400. And we're waiting for the curve to start going down. And the difference is going to be, as you said, we are around 150 per million. The range is still very high. In Europe, you have
we're talking, the UK is on 600.
600.
600 now. The country, most the main European countries are in the 500s.
Yeah.
The US is in the 300s, the up to 300s. But Brazil is racing along at 200 plus and motoring upwards. Chile and Peru are actually even worse.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, well, anyway, I'd like to thank Professor Marina to come and speak to us about the situation in Mexico. I've learned a lot of new things about what's been happening in terms not only of the COVID, but also of the political situation, the balance of forces there in relation to the economy. And so we're going to, as you say, it's uncertain, but there's hope that maybe both the government will be able to achieve some of its objectives and also to avoid any really bad disaster on the question of COVID over the next year, but we shall see. I'd thank Abelardo again if he wants to say anything else.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, as always, talking with you. We're working on it. Yeah. It's interesting. These months have been very creative in terms of organizing ideas. As you see, we have our webinar. It's been the longest.
Yes, I should tell viewers that the webinars that Abelardo, Sergio, and other people in Mexico have been organizing on a regular basis have been fantastic. As long as you're good Spanish speakers.
Yeah, and it's been 12 weeks, you know, it's a very long webinar, and you have activities like this all over, and we are exchanging ideas. So I think we will contribute from a Marxist, leftist perspective to construct the new normality. Okay.
Well, thanks very much, Abelardo. We'll be no doubt soon.